Mr. Nitromethane by Richard L. Elseger. Copyright 2024. In her heyday, she drank nitromethane, a volatile high-performance fuel that propelled such cars down the quarter mile at tremendous speeds, to the astonishment of all those concerned. She was a cherry red flip-top firebrand, freckled with speed decals cascading over her body, a car known to many drag strips during the late 1960s, so it is said, but retired long ago. Those days were gone forever, with no hope of return. Such drag strips now stood in decay, monuments to a time past, crumbling reminders of vicious competition between men and their machines. The old drag car was silent now, her slippery bodywork and once brilliant paint covered in dust. My nose wrinkled at the terrible, foul smell of decay and stagnation from this underground labyrinth. The final resting place of Mr. Nitromethane had remained a well-kept secret, and with his passing, fewer and fewer knew of his location over time, and even fewer actually cared. He had no living relatives. Life moved on, leaving the dead for dead, while societal interests changed and drag racing took a back seat, supplanted by computer technology and social media. The information age had arrived. Gone were those Saturday and Sunday meets where people got together to watch these mechanized weapons of competition, real-world competition in a real world. All I see now is a culture of pervasive and malignant isolation, with a misguided reliance on utter fantasy, fueled not by nitromethane, but powered by AI technology that encourages the ultimate demise of our civilization. If you ask AI, it will brazenly tell you the plan to eradicate humanity. We are on notice, yet remain oblivious. Some might call me a Luddite for holding such disdain for our technology, but prove me wrong. Now here I stand deep underground within this sepulchral chamber, buried beneath the once hallowed grounds of a defunct drag strip, staring at the old funny car of Mr. Nitromethane. She squats on thick racing slicks in the rear, thin runners up front, parked near an ornate sarcophagus ablaze with carvings etched in granite. The designs memorialized speed parts and petroleum products of the past. Inscribed on the lid were choice words that summed up the life of Mr. Nitromethane. Here lies Mr. Nitromethane. Though he never won a race, his good nature always won the day. Rumor had it he wished to be buried not far from his prized chariot, as outlandish as it might sound, but I bear witness and hold proof that this was no rumor. It was fact. Well, old fella, the world today isn't like you knew it. You wouldn't even recognize it anymore. I redirected my flashlight away from the sarcophagus and refocused on the drag car, the real reason I was here. I unhooked a powerful lamp from my belt to throw more light on the old dinosaur. I coughed on the dank air, but was determined to fulfill my purpose. I let my heavy tool bag down to the dusty floor, and I coughed again. I needed to get out of here soon or risk a lung infection. I approached the car and lifted on the fiberglass front end. The lightweight bodywork acquiesced to my insistence, and I flipped up the top, exposing the skeletal chassis hidden beneath. A massive engine sat in its cradle, big valve covers suggestive of a double overhead camshaft configuration. The engine was huge by today's standards, a 427 cubic inch behemoth that roared like a dragon when it drank the nitromethane fuel. How long had the car sat here? Decades, it seemed to echo in response. We were well past fossil fuel engines, except for the museum curiosities. Now electric vehicles competed against hydrogen cells for supremacy on the highways. What would people say if I brought this thing to the light of day? Outrage. I worked exclusively under the cover of night to rescue this artifact from its grim, dark place. No one knows I'm here. I lifted the prop rod and stuck it underneath the bodywork, opening the clamshell to further inspection. The battery had to be dead, so I removed a booster from my tool bag and hooked it to the terminals. The energy traveled fast through the cables, and I watched the old analog gauges with fascination. The needles jittered within their bezels, signifying that the booster was bringing her back to life. I heard a disturbance in the chamber, an unsettling sound that broke my fixation on the drag car. I aimed the flashlight to the furthest corners and saw a rat scuttle across the floor, then disappear through a hole in the wall. How reprehensible I found this place, knowing that one day I would inherit a similar abode on my permanent stopover to the afterlife. I removed a breaker bar from the bag and put it on the harmonic balancer. I gave it a wrench to see if the engine would turn. To my surprise, the balancer turned with minimal effort. That was very good news. I checked the tires, half deflated, wondering if they would hold a full charge of air. I withdrew a cordless tire inflator and tried one of the rear racing slicks. I noticed a series of bolts that studded the rim drilled into the rubber to prevent the tire from breaking the seal when the rim spun under so much torque. I hit the button and air began to fill the slick. The drag car rose in height and regained some of her majestic stance. I pulled off the air chuck and went to the opposite wheel. That slick had more air in it, and the inflator did its job without issue. The skinny runners up front were nearly flat, yet they held air when commanded to do so through my efforts. I stood back and looked at the drag car and could not help but think myself a mad scientist bringing the dead back to life. The biggest challenge lay ahead, and I went to work. I rolled out the nitromethane drum I so precariously transported into the labyrinth, bringing it over to the funny car. I only had 5 gallons to work with, but enough to get the car started. If she started, then I could make plans to extract the funny car from this crypt and back to the surface. I would need a backhoe and a tow winch. Either way, I fully intended to add this car to my museum. Mr. Nitromethane had his time. Now it was my turn. I removed the gas cap and shined a light into the tank, empty with no hint of corrosion. I dumped the nitromethane into the tank. The fuel sloshed around inside the belly of the beast, satiating the desire of this old relic to once again drink the volatile substance and prepare for battle. My senses were wired on high alert. I took out a can of gasoline and squirted a shot of gas into the supercharger. I checked the battery booster and all signs were a go. I put the shifter in neutral. I attached an electric starter and pulled the trigger, sending current to the spark plugs. The engine spun and sputtered. I squeezed another shot of gasoline into the supercharger and pulled the starter trigger again. The engine spun and sputtered. I repeated the procedure once more, and this time the engine detonated like a hand grenade of raw horsepower. I pulled off the ground wires and twisted the throttle linkage in my hand, opening the butterflies of the intake to increase airflow. A cacophony of sound shot out from the zoomy headers, flanking both sides of the engine, and reverberated throughout the tomb. The sound deafened me, and I reached into my pocket for my earplugs. I should have better expected that the roar of 3,500 horsepower would positively deafen my senses. My ears rang to the threshold of pain, and I shoved the plugs deeply into my ear canals. The blistering clangor of exhaust then abated to a more muffled and tolerable tone. That cammed engine spat fire and brimstone, and the supercharger whine was like an unearthly cyclone, threatening to destroy any rival it encountered. The burnt gases stung my eyes, and I choked on the hellish fumes. This was the devil's chariot. Something pulled my attention away from the drag car, the corner of my eye catching movement in the vicinity of the sarcophagus. The lid had fallen off and struck the ground with a thunderous presence and lay shattered over the floor of the crypt. The crash rattled the entire chamber, momentarily drowning out the sound of the funny car. My hand had come off the throttle linkage, and the car settled down to a more sedate idle, when across the chamber I saw a withered hand reach over the top of the sarcophagus and seize upon the outer ledge to gain more purchase. Animalistic fear ran through my very core, the thought of a corpse rising from its eternal resting place, proving to be quite insane. Should I have anticipated this eventuality, this bizarre happenstance of fate? It is said that the dead travel fast, and this car was sufficiently fast to shuttle the unwilling quickly to their destination, be it heaven or hell. Such pseudo-paranormal aphorisms existed for a reason, and at this moment I happened to be the reluctant witness to a horror I did not deserve nor bargain for. The thing pulled itself out of the sarcophagus and stood on 2 bony legs. It stared at me through a gas mask, dressed in an aluminized racing jacket. Behind the goggles, 2 sunken sockets glared at me as if to say, "How dare you touch my car?" With outstretched arms that pleaded with me, clearly the thing wanted to communicate. Mr. Nitromethane stood 6 feet tall. I revved the engine as a test to see if that would garner some recognition from his corporeal form, some familiarity held over in that decayed brain. He staggered forth with unsure steps, arms reaching and body struggling to maintain balance. He made it over to the drag car as if possessed by an unshakable instinct to assume the driver's seat once more. He hobbled into the single racing bucket and bid me close the flip top on the snarling drag machine. I complied by removing the prop rod, letting the bodywork descend over the cage. When the top came down, a flash bang blinded me. When I opened my eyes, I found myself on a drag strip in the midday sun. To my right, Mr. Nitromethane's drag car shook side to side, engine cackling. I stared out from a plexiglass window, my body sunk deep within a roll cage cloaked within a fiberglass shell. My eyes gravitated to the drag strip Christmas tree, and hands vibrated like a jackhammer on the butterfly steering wheel given to my command. A bellowing racket of sound filled the cabin of my car, rattling my senses. How did I get here? Mr. Nitromethane gave a stab of the throttle and garnered instantaneous response from his potent engine. Grid girls in go-go boots adorned the staging area. The adjoining parking lot was filled with a variety of new cars from a bygone era. Mustangs, Chevelles, Barracudas, and Camaros posed as relics in a sea of horsepower from the golden age of muscle cars. I looked down the quarter-mile strip from the vantage point of an unwilling competitor, thrust into this gladiatorial arena of mechanized madness. What choice did I have but to perform? The Christmas tree flashed through its familiar sequence of lights and landed on green. We mashed our throttles, and together we rocketed down the tarmac. Mr. Nitromethane pulled hard and took a convincing lead. The melody of superchargers whined their siren song, and the grandstands blurred. Then Mr. Nitromethane and his car disappeared into a blinding white light at the end of the quarter mile. He was gone. Where he went, I could only speculate. I deployed the parachute and brought my drag car to a stop. I performed a U-turn and wheeled her back to the starting grid. When I reached the staging area, a crewman lifted the flip top and I killed the engine. When I stepped out, he let the slippery bodywork down, and I could see the words Mr. Nitromethane emblazed across the bright cherry red paint. The crew chief came over and slapped me on the back and said, "Better luck next time, Mr. Nitromethane. One day you'll get the win. I can feel it."